A Werewolf Shifter Romance, written by Amelia Hart. Chapter 1. Blood and Moonlight. The festival had been a mistake. Nessa Caldwell realized this truth as the first wave of rogues crashed through the perimeter of Stonehaven Pack territory, their howls splitting the night air. The full moon hung heavy overhead, bathing the clearing in silver light that made the blood on her claws look black. Around her, the screams of her packmates mixed with the snarls of attackers who had no pack, no honor, no mercy. She had been dancing only moments before. 24 years of life, and she could count on one hand the number of times she had allowed herself something as frivolous as dancing. The festival of the full moon was supposed to be sacred, a time when packs gathered to celebrate the blessing of their wolf spirits. Instead, it had become a slaughter. "Fall back to the den," someone shouted, but the command came too late. The rogues had surrounded the clearing, cutting off retreat. Nessa shifted mid-stride, her bones cracking and reforming as her human shape gave way to her wolf. Her pelage emerged in shades of brown and red, like autumn leaves catching fire, with patches of gold across her chest that marked her as her father's daughter. Her father, Beta of Stonehaven, dead 3 years now, and she still felt the weight of his expectations pressing down on her shoulders. A rogue lunged at her from the left, and Nessa twisted, catching him by the throat. He was young, barely more than a pup, but his eyes held the madness that came from living without pack bonds. She ended him quickly, more mercy than he deserved, and spun to face the next threat. The clearing had descended into chaos. Mothers shielded their children, while the warriors formed a defensive line that grew thinner with each passing moment. The rogues fought with the desperation of the damned, some wild and feral, others frighteningly coordinated, mercenaries who had sold their loyalty for gold, throwing themselves forward in waves that seemed endless. "Nessa!" Her mother's voice cut through the din. Edith Caldwell stood at the entrance to the underground den, her graying hair wild around her face as she ushered children inside. At 52, she should have been safely underground with the other elders and healers. Instead, she remained exposed, refusing to seal the entrance while any pup remained above ground. 3 rogues broke through the defensive line, heading straight for the den entrance, heading straight for the children, heading straight for her mother. Nessa didn't think. There was no time for thought, no space for fear. There was only instinct, and the bone-deep certainty that she would die before she let them reach those children. She intercepted the first rogue 5 lengths from the den entrance, her momentum sending them both tumbling across the blood-soaked grass. His claws raked across her ribs, but she barely felt the pain. She tore his throat out and was moving before his body hit the ground. The second rogue was larger, an alpha by the power that radiated from him in waves. He should not have been here, should not have abandoned his pack to become this twisted thing. She met his charge head-on, matching his strength with her own rage. They collided in a tangle of fur and fury, and she felt her shoulder give way beneath his weight. The third rogue slipped past her. "No." The word came out as a howl, raw and desperate. Nessa threw the alpha rogue off her and lunged after the third attacker, but her injured shoulder slowed her down. She watched in horror as the rogue closed the distance to the den entrance, watched her mother step forward with empty hands and fierce eyes. Then the rogue's head snapped back, and he crumpled. One of the pack warriors had thrown a blade with perfect accuracy, saving Edith's life. But the alpha rogue Nessa had been fighting wasn't finished. She felt him coming, felt the displacement of air as he leaped. Nessa spun, but she was off balance, injured, exhausted. The alpha rogue's claws caught her across the chest, and she felt ribs crack beneath the blow. She hit the ground hard enough to drive the air from her lungs, hard enough to make stars explode across her vision. She tried to rise. Her body refused to obey. The alpha rogue loomed over her, his muzzle dripping with the blood of her packmates. He would kill her, she knew, and then he would kill the others. The children. Her mother. Nessa forced herself to shift back to human form, using the last of her strength to meet the rogue's eyes. "Come on, then," she gasped, tasting copper. "Finish it." But the rogue didn't move. His head tilted, listening to something Nessa couldn't hear. Then, impossibly, he backed away. All around the clearing, the surviving rogues were retreating, melting back into the forest as suddenly as they had appeared. Nessa tried to understand what was happening, but her vision was graying at the edges. She could hear voices, could feel hands on her body, could smell her mother's tears. The ground beneath her was warm and wet, and she realized dimly that most of that warmth was her own blood. "The children," she managed to whisper. "Are they safe?" "Hush," her mother said, her voice breaking. "Don't speak. Save your strength." But Nessa could feel her strength draining away, could feel the cold creeping up from her toes. This was how her father had died, she remembered, protecting the pack. There were worse ways to go. "Help is coming," someone said. The Alpha King sent word. "He's almost here." The Alpha King. Valen Grayson, the most powerful shifter in all the territories, commander of every pack within the kingdom. He had ridden with the unnatural speed of an Alpha King, crossing what should have been a day's ride in mere hours. Nessa had never met him, had only heard stories of his strength, his ruthlessness, his absolute authority. And he was coming here, to Stonehaven. Too late, Nessa thought. He was too late. The world was fading now, sounds becoming distant and strange. She could no longer feel the pain, which seemed wrong somehow. Pain meant you were still alive. The absence of pain meant something else entirely. She became aware of new sounds. Horses, heavy footsteps, the rustle of leather and the ring of steel. Warriors, arriving when the battle was already finished. Then there were hands on her. Different hands, larger and warmer. Someone was lifting her, cradling her against a chest that radiated heat and power. Nessa tried to open her eyes but found she no longer had the strength. "Stay with me." The voice was deep, commanding, edged with something that might have been desperation. "Do you hear me? Stay with me." She wanted to obey that voice. Something about it called to her on a level she didn't understand, tugging at a part of her soul she hadn't known existed. But the darkness was patient and relentless, and she was so very tired. "The children," she whispered again. Her last thought, her last words. "They're safe." Then there was nothing but the dark and the cold and the distant sensation of falling. Falling into a void that had no bottom, no end, no light. But just before she fell completely, just before the last spark of consciousness flickered out, she felt something else. A thread, thin as spider silk and strong as iron, wrapping around her soul, pulling her back, refusing to let her go. And she heard that voice again. Closer now, desperate now, raw with an emotion she couldn't name. "Mine," the voice said. "You're mine, and I refuse to lose you." Then teeth, sharp and claiming, piercing the hollow of her throat. Fire flooded her veins where there had been only cold, burning away the darkness, forcing life back into a body that had been ready to surrender it. Pain returned in a rush that stole what little breath remained in her lungs. Her back arched involuntarily as something ancient and forbidden took root in her chest, binding her to the man who held her. She could feel him now, not just his hands or his voice, but his very essence pouring into her through that bite. His strength, his will, his absolute refusal to accept her death. The connection formed between one heartbeat and the next. One moment she was alone in the dark, and the next she was tethered to something vast and powerful and utterly overwhelming. It was too much, too intense, too foreign. She tried to pull away from it, but the thread had already woven itself around her soul, claiming her as thoroughly as those teeth had claimed her flesh. "No," someone was saying, the voice distant and horrified. "My king, the ritual is forbidden. The cost." "I know the cost," the deep voice growled, and Nessa felt the vibration of it through the chest she was pressed against. "And I will pay it gladly. Now stand back and let me finish this." There was more, whispered words in a language Nessa didn't recognize, old and guttural and thick with power. The fire in her veins intensified, spreading from the bite mark on her throat to every corner of her body. Her wounds began to close, flesh knitting back together in a way that felt wrong, unnatural, but undeniably effective. She was being pulled back from the brink, being dragged back into life whether she wished it or not. And in that moment, suspended between death and whatever this was, Nessa Caldwell understood that she had just become something different. Something changed. Something bound to the Alpha King in ways she couldn't begin to comprehend. The last thing she felt before unconsciousness claimed her was the steady, strong beat of his heart against her cheek, and the overwhelming sensation that she would never be free of him again. Not in this life. Perhaps not even in death. Chapter 2. The Binding. Nessa woke to silk. It was the first thing she registered, the soft glide of expensive fabric against her skin where she expected rough wool or nothing at all. The second thing was warmth, a heat that seemed to come from within her own body, rather than from any external fire. The third thing was the presence. Someone was nearby, not in the room with her, but close enough that she could feel them as clearly as she felt her own heartbeat. She knew, without understanding how, that they were standing 3 floors below her current position. She could sense their location as precisely as if she were watching them through clear water. Nessa's eyes snapped open. The ceiling above her was not the familiar rough-hewn timber of her home in Stonehaven. Instead, she found herself staring at stone arches carved with intricate designs. Tapestries hung on the walls, depicting battles and coronations. A fire burned in a hearth large enough to roast an entire deer. This was not home. This was a castle. She sat up slowly, testing her body for injuries. The broken ribs, the torn shoulder, the claw marks across her chest that should have killed her. But her body responded smoothly, without pain, without weakness. She lifted her hands and found them unmarked. Memory crashed through her in a wave that left her gasping. She remembered dying, remembered the cold spreading through her limbs, and the darkness closing in. She remembered a voice refusing to let her go. She remembered teeth sinking into her throat and fire replacing the cold. Nessa's hand flew to her neck. Her fingers found smooth skin and the faint ridge of a scar where those teeth had pierced her flesh. A claiming bite. But that was impossible. Claiming bites were exchanged between mates. She had never chosen anyone. The presence she had been sensing shifted, moving closer, rising through the levels of the castle toward her room. Panic seized her. She threw back the silk coverings and discovered she was dressed in a thin sleeping gown that was not her own. Her legs were steady when her feet hit the cold stone floor. Steadier than they had any right to be after weeks of unconsciousness. 3 weeks. The knowledge came to her unbidden. Absolute certainty without source. She had been asleep for 3 weeks. The door to her chamber opened, and Nessa spun to face the intruder. But it wasn't the owner of that overwhelming presence who entered. It was her mother, Nessa. Edith Caldwell's face crumpled with relief, and she crossed the room to pull her daughter into an embrace that smelled of home and herbs and safety. Thank the moon. You're awake. Nessa held her mother tightly, breathing in the familiar scent, grounding herself. The children, she said, her voice rough from disuse. Tell me they survived. They survived. Edith pulled back, her hands cupping Nessa's face as tears streamed down her cheeks. All of them survived because of you, because you held the line long enough. The Alpha King, Nessa said. He came. He came. Edith's expression shifted, becoming complicated. And he saved your life through means I never thought I would witness. Sit down. We need to talk about what he did to you. Nessa allowed herself to be guided to a chair by the fire. Her mother took the seat across from her, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Edith reached out and took Nessa's hands. What do you remember? Her mother asked gently. I remember dying, Nessa said bluntly. I remember someone refusing to let me die, and I remember a bite. Her hand went to her throat again. A claiming bite. Edith nodded slowly. It was the Alpha King who bit you. Valen Grayson himself. He performed a ritual that hasn't been done in over a century. A life binding. A life binding, Nessa repeated. What does that mean? It means he tied your life force to his own, her mother explained carefully. But such rituals always exact a cost. Every time he draws upon the binding's power, it drains some of his strength, a price no Alpha has willingly paid in centuries. As long as he lives, you cannot die. His strength flows into you, sustaining you, healing you. You are bound to him now in ways that go beyond pack loyalty or mate bonds. Nessa's breath caught. That's impossible. The old magics don't work anymore. Apparently, the Alpha King knows differently. Edith squeezed her daughter's hands. And there are consequences, side effects you need to understand. The presence Nessa had been sensing moved again, closer now. 2 floors below instead of 3. I can feel him, she whispered. Right now, I can feel exactly where he is. Is that part of it? Yes. Her mother's expression was grave. The binding created a connection. You can sense his location, and he can sense yours. You can feel his physical state, whether he's tired, hungry, in pain. It's a tether that cannot be broken. Nessa stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, she could see the sprawling grounds of the royal castle. The forest stretched beyond the walls, dark and vast. Somewhere out there was Stonehaven, her home. And here she was, trapped in a gilded cage, bound to a man she had never met. I never asked for this, she said. No, Edith agreed quietly. But he didn't ask permission before he saved your life. And now you must both live with the consequences. The presence moved again. 1 floor below now, and rising. He's coming, Nessa said, and hated how her heart began to race. Yes. Her mother stood and moved to the door. He has visited every day since you arrived, checking on your condition. This is the first time you've been awake to receive him. She paused at the threshold. Be careful, Nessa. He is the Alpha King, the most powerful shifter in all the territories. But he is also just a man who made an impossible choice. Then she was gone, leaving Nessa alone to face whatever was coming. The presence moved through the floor below, steady and inevitable, until it reached the hallway outside her door. Footsteps, heavy and measured. A pause. Then a knock. Come in, she called, her voice steadier than she felt. The door opened, and Nessa got her first conscious look at the man who had bound her life to his own. Valen Grayson was tall, easily clearing 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to block the doorway. His hair fell to his shoulders in waves of black that caught the firelight, and his beard was neatly trimmed in the style of warriors. But it was his eyes that held her captive, silver gray, intense, and currently fixed on her with an expression she couldn't name. You're awake, he said, and it was the voice from her memories, deep and commanding, though it held something softer now. I'm awake, she confirmed, lifting her chin. Against my will, apparently. Something flickered across his face. Guilt, perhaps. You would have preferred death? I would have preferred a choice, Nessa said quietly, her anger steadier now, tempered by something that felt uncomfortably like curiosity. But it seems you didn't think to ask before you bound me to you. He stepped into the room, and she felt it then. The pull. It wasn't magical or supernatural. It was purely physical, the sudden awareness of him as a male and herself as a female. His scent reached her, pine and smoke, and something wild that made her wolf stir restlessly. She could smell his reaction to her as well, could sense the way his body responded to her presence. The binding had connected them, yes, but this was something else, something more primal. You're right, he said quietly, and the admission clearly cost him. I didn't ask. I couldn't. You were dying, and He stopped, his jaw tightening. You need to stay here at the castle until you've fully recovered, and until we understand the full extent of the binding. That sounds remarkably like a prison, Nessa observed. Call it what you will, he replied, steel beneath the words now. But you will stay. He turned to leave, and Nessa felt the moment he made the decision to retreat. Felt it through the binding, through that connection that let her sense his physical state. He was exhausted, she realized. Bone-deep weary in a way that suggested he hadn't slept properly in weeks. Wait, she found herself saying. He paused at the door, looking back at her. Thank you, Nessa said. The words dragged from somewhere deep and reluctant. For saving my life. Even if I'm angry about the method, I'm still alive because of you. For a moment, something raw and unguarded crossed his face. Then his expression shuddered, going blank and regal once more. The children were safe, he said. You made sure of that before you fell. Sleep well, warrior. Then he was gone, and Nessa was left alone with the fire and the silk, and the persistent awareness of his presence moving through the castle below. She touched the scar on her throat again, feeling the ridge of it beneath her fingers. Her life was no longer entirely her own. She was bound to the Alpha King in ways she didn't fully understand, tethered to him by ancient magic and impossible choices. And the most terrifying part was the way her body had responded to his presence, the way her wolf had recognized him on some primal level that had nothing to do with the binding and everything to do with the dangerous territory between want and need. Nessa returned to the bed, pulling the silk coverings over herself, but sleep was a long time coming. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still feel him, still sense his location in the castle, still remember the way he had looked at her with those silver-gray eyes. 3 weeks ago, she had been a simple warrior, daughter of a beta, protector of her pack. Now she was something else entirely, something bound, something changed, something that belonged to the Alpha King whether she wanted to or not. Chapter 3. Wolves and Courtiers. The weeks that followed Nessa's awakening were an education in survival of a different sort than she had ever known. The royal court was a battlefield, she learned quickly. But the weapons were words instead of claws, and the blood that was spilled remained invisible until it was far too late. Alphas from territories across the kingdom moved through the castle halls with careful steps and calculating eyes, each one measuring her worth, questioning her presence, wondering what hold she had over their king. Nessa discovered the answer was simpler than any of them imagined. None at all. She saw Valen only in passing, and always at a distance. He attended council meetings behind closed doors while she was left to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics alone. The binding let her sense his location constantly, a persistent awareness that told her when he was near, but never near enough. She could feel when he was tired, when he skipped meals, when tension coiled through his body during particularly contentious negotiations. But he never came to her chambers again, never sought her out, never explained what he intended to do with a warrior woman bound to him by forbidden magic. So Nessa did what she had always done when faced with an impossible situation. She fought. The training grounds became her refuge. The castle guards had been wary of her at first, this common warrior from a minor pack who somehow commanded the Alpha King's protection. But Nessa had earned her place the old-fashioned way, by being better than they expected and refusing to back down when they tested her. She was sparring with 3 guards simultaneously when she felt Valen's presence shift from the council chambers to somewhere much closer. The distraction cost her. A wooden practice sword caught her across the ribs, and she spun, disarming her opponent with a move her father had taught her before he died. "Yield," the guard said, grinning despite the sword now pressed to his throat. "Yield," Nessa agreed, lowering her weapon. Sweat plastered her hair to her forehead, and her muscles sang with the pleasant ache of exertion. This, at least, was familiar. This, she understood. "Impressive," a new voice said. And Nessa turned to find a man watching from the edge of the training yard. He was handsome in the way of angels in old paintings, with platinum hair and ice-blue eyes that held none of the warmth his smile suggested. "I had heard the Alpha King was keeping a warrior in his castle, but I didn't realize she was quite so skilled." The guards around Nessa had gone still, their postures shifting into something more formal. This man was important then. An alpha himself, by the power that radiated from him. "Nessa Caldwell," she said, inclining her head slightly. Not a bow, but an acknowledgement of status. "Of Stonehaven Pack." "Tavish," he replied, his smile widening. "Alpha of North March Pack. I've been hoping to meet you, Nessa Caldwell of Stonehaven. There are so few women in this court who know which end of a sword to hold." There was something in his tone that set her teeth on edge, though she couldn't quite identify what. "I imagine the ladies of court find other ways to fight their battles," she said carefully. "Oh, indeed they do." Tavish moved closer, circling her the way a predator circles prey, with whispers and insinuations and carefully planted seeds of doubt. Much more effective than steel in many cases, and far more cruel. "Is there something you wanted, Alpha Tavish?" Nessa asked, turning to keep him in her line of sight. "Merely to satisfy my curiosity," he said. "You see, I've been at court for several weeks now, and I've noticed something peculiar. The Alpha King has been different since he returned from Stonehaven. More distracted, more secretive. And then you appeared, bound to him by magic that most of us thought was nothing more than legend." Nessa said nothing, waiting for him to get to his point. "It makes one wonder," Tavish continued, his voice dropping to something almost conspiratorial. "What hold you have over him, whether you asked for this binding or if it was forced upon you." whether you're a guest in this castle or something else entirely. I'm here until the Alpha King determines I've recovered from my injuries, Nessa said, keeping her voice neutral. Nothing more complicated than that, isn't it? Tavish's eyes gleamed. Because from where I'm standing, it looks remarkably like a cage. A gilded one, certainly, but a cage nonetheless. One wonders if our good king is protecting you or keeping you prisoner. The words struck closer to Nessa's own doubts than she liked to admit. But she had learned young not to show weakness to those who would exploit it. I can leave the castle grounds whenever I wish, she lied smoothly. Can you? Tavish asked, and the challenge in his tone was unmistakable. Can you really? Or would the binding pull you back before you made it past the gates? Nessa didn't answer. She didn't know the answer, and that uncertainty was a weakness Tavish had clearly already identified. If you ever need an ally at court, he said, his voice softening into something that might have passed for kindness. Someone who understands what it's like to be used as a piece in someone else's game. You know where to find me. Then he was gone, leaving Nessa standing in the training yard with suspicions blooming in her chest like poisonous flowers. The binding let her sense Valen's location. She focused on it now, following that invisible thread to where he stood on a balcony overlooking the training grounds. He had been watching. The entire time Tavish had been speaking to her, Valen had been there, close enough to intervene, but choosing not to. Their eyes met across the distance, silver gray, clashing with green. Then he turned and walked away, and Nessa was left with more questions than answers. That night, unable to sleep, Nessa wandered the castle halls. She had learned the layout over the past weeks, memorizing exits and defensible positions out of habit. The guards nodded to her as she passed, having grown accustomed to her restless nighttime wanderings. She found herself outside the council chambers, drawn there by the sound of raised voices. The door was thick, but her shifter hearing picked up fragments of the conversation within. Cannot be coincidence. That was Valen's voice, hard and commanding. 3 packs attacked in as many months, always during festivals or gatherings. Someone is orchestrating this. The rogues could simply be growing bolder, another voice argued. It doesn't necessarily mean. It means exactly what I think it means. Valen's words cut through the objection. Someone is deliberately targeting packs loyal to the throne, weakening our alliances, testing our defenses. Nessa's breath caught. The attack on Stonehaven hadn't been random. Someone had planned it, had sent those rogues deliberately to slaughter her pack during a sacred festival. What about the Caldwell woman? A third voice asked. Does she know? No. Valen's answer was immediate and firm. And she won't. Not until we understand the full scope of the threat. She's been through enough. Rage, white-hot and immediate, flooded through Nessa. He was keeping this from her. Keeping the truth about her pack's attack from her because he had decided she was too fragile to handle it. She moved away from the door before her fury could drive her to do something foolish. The binding thrummed between them, and she wondered if Valen could feel her anger through it the way she could feel his exhaustion. Back in her chambers, Nessa stood at the window, staring out at the moonlit grounds. The binding had given her a measure of Valen's physical state, but not his thoughts. She couldn't tell what he was thinking. Couldn't understand why he insisted on protecting her from truth she had every right to know. But she could feel his presence moving through the castle below, could track his progress from the council chambers toward his own apartments. And she could feel the weight of his weariness, the bone-deep fatigue of a man carrying responsibilities too vast for any single person to bear. The fury in her chest flickered, complicated by something that might have been understanding or sympathy or both. Tavish's words echoed in her mind. Was she a guest or a prisoner? Protected or kept? And what would she discover if she dug deeper into the secrets Valen was keeping from her? Nessa touched the scar on her throat, feeling the familiar ridge beneath her fingers. The binding connected them. Yes, but it also divided them. She was bound to a man who treated her like fragile glass, who made decisions about her life without consulting her, who watched her from a distance but never came close enough to explain what he wanted from her. She had survived the attack on her pack. She had survived dying and being dragged back to life by forbidden magic. She would survive this too. This strange limbo between belonging and isolation. But she would not remain ignorant. If Valen wouldn't tell her what was happening, if he insisted on keeping secrets for her own protection, then she would find out on her own. Whatever games were being played at this court, Whatever conspiracy had led to the attack on Stonehaven, Nessa Caldwell was no longer content to be a piece moved by others. It was time to become a player in her own right. Chapter 4. Forest Truths. The ritual hunt was announced 3 days later, and Nessa knew immediately that she would be going. Absolutely not, Valen said when she cornered him outside the war room. It was the first time they had spoken directly in weeks, and his silver-gray eyes held frustration and something that looked close to concern. The hunt is dangerous even for experienced— I am experienced, Nessa interrupted. I've been hunting since I was 12, and unless you've forgotten, I'm the one who held off rogues while your warriors were still days away. A muscle ticked in his jaw. I haven't forgotten. Then you also haven't forgotten that we're bound, she pressed. Your counsel questions what that means, what I am to you. If I stay behind while you ride out with every other alpha, it will only fuel speculation. Let them speculate, Valen said. But his tone had shifted. And what happens when they decide I'm your weakness? Nessa asked quietly. When they think you're keeping me locked away because I'm leverage? That's exactly what Tavish has been suggesting. Valen's eyes darkened. Tavish has been speaking to you? Near me, Nessa corrected. There's a difference. But he's not wrong about everything. This binding connects us. If I can't be by your side for something as simple as a hunt, what message does that send? Valen studied her for a long moment. You ride at dawn. Stay close to my guard. I'll stay close to you, Nessa countered. That's what the binding demands anyway. Or have you not noticed that being too far apart causes discomfort? She had discovered that 2 nights ago, when Valen had ridden to the western borders. The ache had started in her chest, growing worse until he returned. I've noticed, Valen said, his voice rough. Then he walked away, leaving Nessa with a hollow victory. Dawn arrived cold and clear, the forest beyond the castle walls wreathed in mist. Nessa dressed in borrowed riding leathers, her hair braided back. Valen had arranged a gray mare with kind eyes for her. The hunting party consisted of 20 riders, Valen and his guard, plus alphas from 6 territories. Tavish was among them, his platinum hair catching the early light as he mounted a white stallion. He caught Nessa's eye and smiled, the expression holding too many teeth. Valen appeared on a black destrier that stood nearly 17 hands high. He wore leather and dark fur, his black hair loose, his beard making him look every inch the warrior king he was. When his eyes found Nessa, something flashed across his face too quickly to name. They rode out in formation, following game trails deeper into ancient forest. The ritual hunt was supposed to strengthen pack bonds, a tradition as old as shifters themselves. But Nessa couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The sensation grew stronger as they moved deeper into the trees. She focused on the binding, using it to gauge Valen's awareness. He felt alert, but not alarmed. It was Tavish who made the first mistake. They had dismounted to track when Nessa heard the snap of a deliberately broken branch. She spun and saw Tavish's hand move in a gesture too controlled to be accidental. The horses nearest to Valen spooked, one kicking out with iron-shod hooves that would have caught the Alpha King if he hadn't moved with inhuman speed. Control your mount, Valen snapped at the stammering rider, but his eyes went to Tavish, suspicious. How unfortunate, Tavish said smoothly. These woods make even trained war horses nervous. Perhaps we should split into smaller groups. We stay together, Valen said flatly, and the command brooked no argument. But the damage was done. The rest of the hunt proceeded with tension that made Nessa's skin prickle. When they finally brought down a massive elk just before sunset, there was no joy in the kill. We'll camp here tonight, Valen announced. Return at first light. The alphas dispersed to set up bedrolls, and Nessa found herself following Valen as he moved away from camp, drawn by the binding. She found him at a clearing beside a stream, staring into the darkening forest. You felt it too, she said quietly. That what happened with the horses wasn't an accident. I felt it, he confirmed without turning. Tavish is playing a dangerous game. Why? Nessa moved closer. What does he gain by making you look vulnerable? Power, Valen said simply. If he can make them doubt my strength, my judgment, he can position himself as an alternative. A younger, stronger leader for uncertain times. Times made uncertain by someone orchestrating attacks on your loyal packs, Nessa said, and felt him go still. Yes, I know. I heard you discussing it with your council. 3 packs attacked in as many months, always during festivals. Someone targeting your alliances. Valen turned to face her, caught between anger and resignation. You were eavesdropping. You were keeping secrets. She shot back. About an attack that killed members of my pack. About a conspiracy that may have murdered my father 3 years ago. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Your father's death was investigated, Valen said carefully. There was no evidence of foul play. Because no one was looking for it, Nessa said. And her mother's revelation from that morning rang in her ears. Edith had finally told her what she had been keeping to herself. He was looking into something before he died. My mother told me she hadn't spoken sooner because she feared the grief would break me while I was still healing. He told her that he had discovered a conspiracy, that someone was planning to destabilize the kingdom by targeting loyal packs. He died before he could identify the source. Realization dawned across Valen's face. The timing would be right, he said slowly. 3 years ago there were smaller incidents. Skirmishes we attributed to random rogue activity. If someone was planning this even then my father discovered it and was killed for it. Nessa finished. And I have a right to know. I have a right to be part of finding whoever is responsible. Valen moved closer, and Nessa's breath caught at the intensity in his silver-gray eyes. You have every right, he said quietly, and I was wrong to keep it from you. I told myself I was protecting you, but the truth is, I was protecting myself. From what? Nessa asked. From this, he said, and closed the remaining distance between them. For a moment, she thought he would kiss her. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with unexpected gentleness. The binding thrummed between them, amplifying every point of near contact until Nessa could barely breathe. Then, with visible effort, Valen stepped back. I can't, he said, his voice rough. You never asked for this binding. Never chose me. I won't compound what I did by taking more than you're willing to give. And if I'm willing? Nessa heard herself ask. Are you? He studied her face with an intensity that felt like it could see through to her bones. Or is it just the binding making you think you want something you wouldn't choose freely? Nessa didn't have an answer. The binding was there, constant, and she couldn't separate what she felt from what it made her feel. I chose to die protecting my pack, she said finally. You chose to bring me back. We both made impossible choices. Maybe it's time we stopped punishing ourselves for that and started figuring out what comes next. What comes next, Valen said, is we find whoever orchestrated the attack on Stonehaven. We expose the conspiracy your father discovered, and we make sure no other pack suffers what yours did. Together, Nessa said. Not a question. Together, Valen agreed, and something in his expression shifted. No more unnecessary secrets. I'll tell you what I can, when it won't put others at risk. No more protecting you from truths you have every right to know. No more keeping me at a distance, Nessa countered. If we're bound, then we're bound. For better or worse. The corner of his mouth lifted in something that might have been a smile. You might regret that. I already regret plenty, Nessa said. What's one more impossible thing? They returned to camp together, and if the other alphas noticed the shift between them, they were wise enough not to comment. But Tavish's eyes followed them through the darkness, calculating and cold. And Nessa knew they had just made themselves into a united target. Whatever game he was playing, whatever conspiracy had taken her father and attacked her pack, it had just become personal. Chapter 5. Blood and Fire. The evidence arrived 2 days after the hunt, delivered by a scout tracking rogue movements through the northern territories. Nessa stood beside Valen in the council chamber, as the scout laid out his findings. Correspondence intercepted from a rogue camp, decoded to reveal coordination between attacks, supply routes, festival dates, pack locations, weaknesses and defenses, and a name, mentioned once but enough to damn him. Tavish. This proves nothing, one council member argued. Anyone could have forged these documents. We also have a witness, Valen interrupted coldly. A rogue captured during the attack on Stonehaven. He's been recovering in the dungeons, and yesterday he broke his silence. He identified Tavish as the one who recruited him, who promised gold and territory for attacking packs loyal to the throne. The council chamber erupted. Alphas demanding action, others calling for more proof, voices rising. Through it all, Nessa felt the weight of what they had uncovered. Her pack had been attacked on Tavish's orders. Her packmates had died because one man wanted power. "Bring him in," Valen commanded. Tavish entered 10 minutes later, expression mild curiosity. He looked at the assembled alphas, at the evidence spread across the table, and his smile never faltered. "Is there a problem, my king?" he asked smoothly. "You tell me," Valen said, gesturing to the correspondence. "These were found in a rogue camp. They detail attacks on my loyal packs. Your name appears in them." Tavish examined the documents. "Forgeries," he said dismissively. "Someone is trying to frame me. Perhaps you should be asking who benefits from turning the Alpha King against one of his strongest allies." "We also have a witness," Nessa said, her voice cutting through his deflection. "A rogue who identifies you as the one who recruited him, who paid him to attack Stonehaven during the full moon festival." For the first time, something flickered across Tavish's features. Anger, quickly masked. "The word of a rogue against an alpha? You cannot seriously be considering—" "I'm not considering anything," Valen said, rising from his throne. The power radiating from him made every shifter feel his authority. "I'm stating facts. You orchestrated attacks on my packs. You destabilized my kingdom. You murdered innocents in a bid for power you were never worthy to hold. You have no proof," Tavish snarled, composure cracking. "Just the word of a broken rogue and convenient documents. Then you won't mind being confined while we investigate," Valen said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "Take him to the dungeons. High security. No visitors except by my express permission." Guards moved forward, and Tavish's face twisted with rage. For a moment, Nessa thought he would fight. But even Tavish wasn't foolish enough to attack the Alpha King in his throne room. "This isn't over," he said, as they led him away. "You're making a mistake you'll regret." "The only mistake I made," Valen said quietly, "was not seeing you for what you were sooner." The council session continued long after Tavish was removed, Alphas debating punishment and political fallout. None of them noticed that one of Valen's advisors, Brennan, had left the chamber early, his expression unreadable. A small detail that would later matter far more than anyone realized. Night had fallen by the time they dispersed. Nessa and Valen walked the corridors together in exhausted silence, both processing the day's revelations. They had just reached where their paths would diverge when the first explosion shook the castle. The blast came from the dungeons, magical fire that sent tremors through stone. Valen's hand found Nessa's instantly, pulling her against the wall as debris rained down. "Tavish's allies," Valen said, already moving toward the source. "They're trying to free him, or kill you in the chaos," Nessa countered, keeping pace. She could hear shouts, the clash of steel, snarls of combat echoing through the stone corridors. They rounded a corner and found 3 men in dark leathers, faces covered, blades drawn. Not shifters, mercenaries, which explained how they had gotten past magical defenses. The first attacker lunged at Valen, and Nessa moved on instinct. She had no weapon, but she didn't need one. She shifted partially, extending her claws and sharpening her senses. The attacker turned toward her, surprised, and paid for his distraction when her claws found his throat. Valen had dispatched one attacker and was engaging the third when Nessa felt the fourth coming from behind. She spun, but not fast enough. A blade caught her across the forearm, slicing through leather into flesh. The pain was sharp, and Nessa used it to fuel her next attack. She drove her claws into the attacker's throat and felt him go down. "Nessa!" Valen was at her side instantly, his hands on her bleeding arm, his face barely controlled rage. "How bad is it?" "Just a cut," she said, though blood dripped steadily. "I've had worse." But Valen wasn't listening. He stared at her wound with something raw and desperate. Then he was pulling her away from the bodies, into an alcove offering temporary shelter. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough and shaking. "But I wasn't," Nessa interrupted. "I'm fine. The binding will heal this faster anyway." "The binding," Valen repeated, laughing without humor. "The binding that was supposed to keep you safe, and instead it just keeps putting you in danger. Keeps making you a target for everyone who wants to get to me." I was a target the moment Tavish attacked Stonehaven, Nessa said firmly. This isn't on you, isn't it? Valen's hands framed her face, and Nessa's breath caught at the intensity in his silver-gray eyes. I bound you to me, made you part of my life, my court, my battles. Everything that threatens me now threatens you too. Then we face it together, Nessa said. That's what the binding means. Not that you protect me from everything, but that we protect each other. Something broke in Valen's expression. Some final wall crumbling. I can't lose you, he said, the words dragged from somewhere deep and vulnerable. I know I have no right to feel that way. No, you never chose this. But I can't. Nessa kissed him. It wasn't planned. She simply reached up and pulled his mouth down to hers, cutting off his words. The binding flared between them, amplifying sensation until she felt dizzy with it. His lips were warm and demanding, his hands steady despite the tremor she could feel in his muscles. This was nothing like the almost kiss in the forest. This was fire and desperation and acknowledgement of something that had been building since the moment he had refused to let her die. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Valen rested his forehead against hers. We should check on the guards, he said, though he made no move away. Make sure Tavish is still contained. In a moment, Nessa said. Her arm was still bleeding, but the binding had begun its work. She could feel flesh knitting together, faster than it should, but not unnaturally so. First, tell me what happens now. Now, Valen said, his voice still rough but steadier. We make sure Tavish and his allies pay for what they've done. We root out every conspirator, every traitor who thought they could tear down what we've built. And then, he paused, his thumb tracing her lower lip with unexpected gentleness. Then we figure out what we are to each other. Beyond the binding. Beyond duty. I'd like that, Nessa whispered. They emerged from the alcove to find the guards had contained the situation. 3 more mercenaries captured, 2 dead, and Tavish still secured in the dungeons, though his cell had sustained damage from the blast. Valen issued orders with calm efficiency, while Nessa had her arm properly bandaged by the castle healer. As dawn broke over the castle walls, they stood together on the battlements, watching the sun rise over a kingdom still under threat, but now with a clearer enemy in sight. Nessa touched the scar on her throat absently, thinking about the binding that had seemed like a curse weeks ago. Now it felt different. Not a chain, but a connection, a choice she was beginning to understand and accept. Valen's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with natural ease. We're going to end this, he said. Not a question, but a promise. Together. Nessa agreed, and felt the binding pulse between them, warm and steady, and no longer something to fear, but something to claim. Chapter 6. Claiming and Choice. 3 days passed before Nessa realized the binding had changed. She was in the training yard, sparring with one of Valen's personal guards, when a wave of frustration crashed through her that was not her own. It was sharp and immediate, carrying the distinct flavor of a political argument going nowhere productive, and she knew, without needing to ask, that it came from Valen. The guard's practice sword caught her across the shoulder, and Nessa raised her hand in acknowledgement. I need a moment, she said, heading inside without waiting for a response. She found her mother in the healing rooms, organizing supplies that had been depleted during the recent attack. Edith looked up as Nessa entered, and something in her daughter's expression made her set down the bundle of herbs she had been sorting. It's evolved, hasn't it? Her mother asked quietly. The binding. Nessa nodded, still trying to articulate the strangeness of feeling someone else's emotions. I can feel what he's feeling now. Before, it was only physical, his location, his exhaustion. But now I sense actual emotions, his frustration, his worry, his exhaustion, his frustration, his worry, his exhaustion. That's natural, Edith said, gesturing for Nessa to sit. Life bindings are meant to evolve over time, especially when both parties begin to accept the connection emotionally rather than just tolerating it physically. The kiss, Nessa said, understanding dawning. That's what triggered the evolution. The kiss was an acknowledgement, her mother confirmed. You both stopped fighting what the binding was trying to create and allowed yourselves to feel what was already there. The magic responded to that acceptance, deepened the connection you had been resisting. Nessa touched the scar on her throat, feeling the familiar ridge beneath her fingers. What happens next? Does it keep evolving? I don't know, Edith admitted honestly. Life bindings are rare, and the records about them are fragmentary at best. But I do know this. The binding will only grow as strong as the connection between you. If you continue to open yourself to him, and he to you, then yes, it will deepen further. The question was whether Nessa wanted that. Whether she was ready to be that vulnerable, that exposed, to someone who had bound her to him without asking permission first. As if summoned by her thoughts, she felt Valen's presence moving through the castle toward her location. The frustration she had sensed earlier had faded, replaced by something warmer, intent, purpose, determination. He found her as she was leaving the healing rooms, his silver-gray eyes finding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "We need to talk," he said, privately. Nessa followed him to a small chamber overlooking the castle gardens, a space clearly designed for quiet conversations away from the chaos of court. When the door closed behind them, Valen turned to face her, and she could feel the nervous energy radiating from him through the binding. "You can feel me now," he said, not a question. "Since this morning," Nessa confirmed. "Your emotions, not just physical sensations. My mother says it's because the binding evolved after we stopped fighting it." "I know. I can feel you too," Valen said, moving closer. "Your determination when you train, your anger at being kept in the dark for so long, your confusion about what this thing between us actually means." Nessa crossed her arms, suddenly feeling exposed. "So, what did you want to talk about?" "I want to complete the bond," he said quietly. "Not just the life binding that keeps you tethered to me, but a true mate bond. I want to claim you properly, the way it should have been done from the beginning." Nessa's heart stuttered. "That's not something you can just ask for." "I know," Valen said, and she could feel his sincerity through the binding. "I'm not asking you to say yes right now. I'm asking you to consider it. To think about whether you want to be bound to me not just by magic and circumstance, but by choice. I don't know if I can separate what I feel from what the binding makes me feel," Nessa admitted. "How do I know if I want this, or if it's just the magic pushing me toward you?" "You don't," Valen said bluntly. "And neither do I. But here's what I do know. I've lived for 32 years without feeling this connection to anyone. I've ruled alone, fought alone, borne the weight of this crown alone. And then you died in my arms, and something in me refused to accept it. Not because of duty or politics or strategy, but because losing you felt like losing part of myself." He reached up to cup her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "Maybe that's the binding. Maybe it's fate. Or maybe it's just the simple truth that you're the strongest, most infuriating, most remarkable woman I've ever met, and I want you to be mine in every way that matters." Before Nessa could find words to respond, the binding flared with sudden, sharp alarm. Valen's head snapped toward the door, his body going rigid. "Something's wrong," he said, already moving. But Nessa was already reaching for the weapons she kept strapped beneath her training leathers. They emerged into the corridor to find it empty, but the alarm she felt through the binding was growing stronger with each passing second. Then she smelled it. Smoke. Not from the hearths, but from something burning that shouldn't be. And beneath it, the distinct scent of shifter blood. They ran toward her chambers, following the scent trail, and found her door hanging open. Inside, the room was in shambles. Furniture overturned, tapestries torn from the walls, her possessions scattered across the floor, and in the center of it all stood Tavish. He looked wild, his platinum hair matted with dirt and blood, his ice-blue eyes holding the gleam of madness. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice rough. "Knew the binding would pull you here eventually. How did you get out?" Valen demanded, moving to put himself between Tavish and Nessa. "I have friends in unexpected places," Tavish said, circling them slowly. "People who understand that the kingdom needs a stronger leader, one who isn't distracted by a common warrior. This was never about politics," Nessa said. "This was about your pride. Your ego couldn't handle that Valen was chosen as Alpha King instead of you. I should have been king. Tavish snarled. I'm younger, stronger, more adaptable. But the council chose tradition over progress. You mean orchestrating attacks on innocent Pax? Nessa shot back. Murdering families during sacred festivals? Tavish's smile was all teeth and rage. Sometimes you need to burn down the old growth to make room for something new. He shifted mid-sentence, his human form exploding into his wolf. The white beast was massive, nearly as large as an alpha king's wolf should be, and Nessa realized with chilling clarity that Tavish had been hiding his true strength all along. Volin shifted to meet him, his black wolf form even larger, and the two alphas collided with a force that shook the room. Nessa shifted as well, her smaller reddish-brown wolf form moving to flank Tavish, looking for an opening. The fight was brutal and fast. But unlike that night at Stonehaven, this time Nessa and Vaylin fought as one. Coordinated, deliberate, unyielding. Tavish fought with the desperation of someone with nothing left to lose. All strategy abandoned in favor of raw violence. Vaylin met him with controlled fury, every move calculated to protect Nessa while still engaging the threat. Nessa saw her opportunity when Tavish overextended trying to reach Vaylin's throat. She lunged, her teeth finding purchase in Tavish's hind leg, and felt bone crack beneath her jaw. Tavish howled and spun toward her. Then Vaylin was there, his massive form driving Tavish away from Nessa and into the stone wall. The white wolf struggled, snapping and clawing. But Vaylin's teeth found his throat and held. For a long moment, their eyes met. Silver gray against ice blue. And Nessa felt the exact moment Tavish understood he had lost. Vaylin's jaws closed, and it was over. The silence that followed was deafening. Both Nessa and Vaylin shifted back to human form, breathing hard, covered in blood and sweat. Vaylin moved to Nessa immediately, his hands running over her body, checking for injuries. I'm fine, she said, catching his hands. I'm fine. We're both fine. He came for you, Vaylin said, his voice shaking. He knew I would feel your fear through the binding and come running. But he was wrong, Nessa said quietly. Because we fought together. Because the binding makes us stronger, not weaker. Vaylin pulled her against his chest, holding her tightly. Through the binding, she could feel everything he was feeling. Relief, rage, fear, and beneath it all, a fierce possessiveness that should have frightened her, but somehow didn't. Claim me, she said into the silence. Vaylin pulled back to look at her. What? You asked if I would consider letting you complete the mate bond, Nessa said, her voice steady. I'm saying yes. Claim me. Make this binding a choice instead of just a necessity. You almost died, Vaylin said carefully. You're in shock. You don't need to decide this now. I'm not in shock, Nessa interrupted. I'm clear-headed for the first time since you bound me. I spent weeks resenting what you did, but you were right earlier. Maybe it's the binding, maybe it's fate, or maybe it's just the truth that when I thought Tavish might hurt you, when I saw him lunge for your throat, I realized I couldn't lose you either. She reached up to cup his face. So yes, I want this. I want you. Not because the binding forces me to, but because I'm choosing to. Vaylin's kiss was answer enough, and when his teeth found the mate mark on her throat, when the binding flared and deepened and became something infinitely more permanent, Nessa felt the last of her resistance crumble. The ritual was instinctive and ancient. His bite deepened the mark on her throat, and she returned it, her teeth finding the junction where his neck met his shoulder. The taste of his blood on her tongue was copper and power, and the binding exploded between them in a cascade of sensation. When it was done, when the mate bond settled into place alongside the life binding, Nessa felt the difference immediately. Where the life binding had connected their physical states, the mate bond connected everything. Mine, Vaylin said against her throat. Yours, Nessa agreed. And you're mine. This was her choice. Her claim. Her mate. Chapter 7. Proving worth. The ritual of mating was consummated in the traditional way, behind closed doors with only the moon as witness. When Nessa emerged from Vaylin's chambers the following morning, bearing fresh claiming marks visible to every shifter in the castle, she knew the easy part was over. Now came the hard part, proving she deserved to stand beside the Alpha King as his mate and equal. The council convened that afternoon, to discuss the fallout from Tavish's death and his failed conspiracy. 6 northern packs had been found to have connections to the North March Alpha, either through trade agreements that now looked suspiciously timed, or through warriors who had been seen meeting with known rogues. Nessa stood beside Valen during the proceedings, feeling the weight of every eye assessing her. She was no longer just the warrior woman saved through forbidden magic. She was his mate now, and that position came with expectations. The Northern Territories must answer for their Alpha's crimes, one council member argued. The packs themselves may not have known the full extent, another countered. What does the Alpha King's mate think? The question came from an older Alpha named Grayson, his tone respectful but challenging. You fought beside the king to end his threat. Surely you have an opinion. This was a test, Nessa realized. They wanted to see if she had wisdom to advise their king. I think we need to distinguish between active conspiracy and passive negligence, Nessa said carefully. The packs who knowingly aided Tavish should face consequences proportional to their crimes. But those who were kept in the dark deserve a chance to prove their loyalty under new leadership. She paused. My pack was attacked because of Tavish's ambitions. I want justice. But creating martyrs out of innocence will only plant seeds for future rebellion. We need to be firm, but fair. Grayson nodded slowly, and Nessa felt Valen's approval through the bond. She had passed the first test. 3 days later, a challenger emerged. His name was Corvin, Alpha from the Western Territories, and he made his challenge publicly. With all due respect to the Alpha King, Corvin said, his choice of mate is unusual. A warrior from a minor pack, elevated not through merit, but through circumstance. How can we trust she has the strength to represent us as Luna Queen? Nessa stood from her place beside Valen's throne. You question my strength, Alpha Corvin? I question your experience, Corvin replied smoothly. Then let's settle your questions the old way, Nessa said. Traditional combat, first blood or submission. You and me, in front of everyone who doubts I earned my place here. Corvin smiled. I accept. The combat circle was drawn in the training yard. By the time they faced each other, half the court had gathered. Nessa could feel Valen's concern through the mate bond, but also his confidence. Corvin was larger by a significant margin, with bulk from years of training and natural alpha dominance. But Nessa had spent her life being underestimated. They circled, and Nessa let Corvin make the first move. He lunged with confidence, and Nessa sidestepped, using his momentum against him. The crowd murmured. Stand still and fight, Corvin growled. I am fighting, Nessa replied calmly, just not the way you expected. The next exchanges followed the same pattern. Corvin fought like an alpha used to overwhelming opponents with raw power. Nessa fought like a warrior who survived by being smarter and quicker. When she saw her opening, she took it. Corvin overextended, and Nessa ducked under his arm, shifted partially to extend her claws, and drove them across his ribs hard enough to draw blood. First blood. The fight was over. Corvin stood frozen, staring at the red seeping through his shirt. Do you still question whether I earned my place, Alpha Corvin? Nessa asked quietly. Slowly, he dropped to one knee. No, Luna Queen. I do not. The title hung in the air, spoken publicly for the first time by someone other than Valen. When the other Alphas followed Corvin's lead, kneeling in acknowledgement, Nessa felt something shift. She had proven herself. Over the following weeks, Nessa settled into her role with determination. She attended council meetings, learned pack politics, and began to understand the complex web of alliances holding the kingdom together. And she watched. She watched how information flowed through the castle, the patterns of who spoke to whom. It was during these observations that she noticed something odd about Consolero Brennan. He was Valen's oldest advisor, supposedly beyond question. But Nessa noticed he was always late to meetings where important decisions were made, always absent when crucial intelligence arrived, always somewhere else when raids needed planning. She mentioned her observations to Valen one night. It's probably nothing, she said, but it's the kind of pattern my father taught me to watch for. Valen was quiet, thinking through implications. Brennan has always been useful. He's the kind of advisor who tells you what you need to hear, or what he wants you to hear, Nessa countered. Has he ever steered you wrong? Not obviously, Valen admitted, but there have been times when his advice led to delays. Like arriving too late to Stonehaven? Nessa asked quietly. The question hung between them. What if that delay hadn't been accidental? The investigation was quiet and thorough. When they confronted Brennan with evidence, meetings with Tavish's representatives, subtle sabotage, carefully timed absences, he didn't even try to deny it. I did it for the kingdom, he said bitterly. Valen is a good king, but too cautious. Tavish promised change, promised a stronger kingdom. Tavish promised chaos, Valen said coldly. And you enabled him. You helped orchestrate attacks that killed innocents. I never meant for anyone to die, Brennan protested. Tavish said the attacks would be bloodless. And you believed him? Nessa said, her voice sharp. You believed a man who thought murdering families during festivals was acceptable. Brennan had no answer. He was stripped of his position and banished to neutral territories, forbidden from ever returning. A week later, Nessa and Valen traveled to Stonehaven. It was time to honor the fallen properly. Nessa's mother met them at the border, and together they walked to the memorial garden. Nessa placed flowers on each grave, speaking names she had known her entire life. Warriors who had trained beside her, elders who had taught her, children who had never grown up. They died because I wasn't fast enough, she said quietly. They died because Tavish orchestrated an attack during a sacred festival. Valen corrected. And you held the line long enough that most survived. The children all survived. You did what your father would have been proud of. Nessa touched the scar on her throat. I just wish he could have been here to see it. He knows, Edith said softly. Wherever warriors go, your father knows you made him proud. You always did. They stayed in Stonehaven for 3 days. And when they left, Nessa felt something settle. She would always mourn those lost, but she could honor them by building something better. She was Luna Queen now, and she would make sure that title meant something. Chapter 8. Legacy and Light. 6 months had passed since the day Tavish died, and the conspiracy that had nearly torn the kingdom apart was finally put to rest. Nessa stood at the window of the royal chambers, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where the Alpha King's heir grew, conceived only weeks after their coronation. The morning sun painted the castle grounds in shades of gold, and she could see the training yards where a new generation of warriors practiced forms she had helped design, women and men training side by side, as it should have always been. So much had changed in half a year. The kingdom bore the marks of transformation in ways both visible and subtle. New laws had been enacted, protecting smaller packs from exploitation by larger territories. An intelligence network had been established, coordinated by warriors Nessa had personally trained, to monitor rogue activity and identify threats before they could become attacks. Trade routes had been secured, alliances strengthened, and the northern territories that had been complicit in Tavish's conspiracy now operated under new leadership that understood the cost of betrayal. And throughout it all, Nessa had stood beside Valen as his equal. Not just his mate, but his partner in governance. Luna Queen in more than just title. You're thinking too hard again. Valen's voice came from behind her, warm with affection. His arms wrapped around her waist, his hands settling over hers on her belly. I can feel it through the bond. Your mind is racing. Nessa leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her shoulders. The mate bond thrummed between them, as natural now as breathing. I'm thinking about how different everything is from 6 months ago. How different I am. Better different or worse different? Valen asked, his breath warm against her ear. Different, Nessa said, turning in his arms to face him. 6 months ago, I was furious with you for binding me without permission, for taking away my choice. And now? Now? He prompted gently. Now I can't imagine choosing anything else, she admitted. Even knowing everything that would happen, all the pain and fear and uncertainty, I would still choose this. Choose you. Choose us. Valen's expression softened, and through the bond, Nessa could feel the depth of his emotion. Love, fierce and absolute. Relief that she didn't regret the path they had walked together. And beneath it all, a truth he had been carrying since the night he had refused to let her die. There's something I need to tell you, he said quietly. Something I should have told you months ago, but I was afraid it would sound like I was trying to justify what I did. Nessa waited, sensing this was important. The night of the attack on Stonehaven, Valen began. I was in council when word arrived. But before the messenger even spoke, I felt something. A pull, sharp and undeniable, like a thread connecting me to someone I had never met. I knew, without understanding how, that something was wrong. That someone was in danger. Someone who mattered. He paused, his silver-gray eyes searching hers. I rode harder than I've ever ridden in my life, Nessa. I pushed my horse to the breaking point trying to reach you in time. And when I arrived, when I saw you dying in the moonlight, I felt that thread tightening. I could feel your life slipping away. Could feel the moment your heart began to fail. Nessa's breath caught. That's why you did the ritual. You could already feel the connection. I think we were always meant to be bound. Valen said softly. I think fate or destiny or whatever force governs shifter bonds had already started weaving us together. The life binding just made it visible, made it impossible to ignore. But the connection was already there, waiting for us to acknowledge it. Tears pricked at Nessa's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. I felt it too, she whispered. In that moment when I was dying, when everything was going dark, I felt someone refusing to let me go. I thought it was just the desperation of not wanting to die, but it was more than that. It was you, already holding on to me before the binding was even complete. We were destined, Valen said. And it wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Everything that happened, all the pain and struggle, was leading us to each other. Then I'm glad I died that night, Nessa said, and smiled at Valen's sharp intake of breath. Not because I wanted to die, but because it brought you to me. It showed us both what we were too stubborn or too afraid to see otherwise. Valen kissed her then, deep and thorough. And the mate bond sang between them with a harmony that felt like coming home. A knock at the door interrupted them. My king, my queen, a servant's voice called. The Alphas have begun to arrive for the ceremony. They're assembling in the Great Hall. Today was the day. The official coronation ceremony where Nessa would be formally recognized as Luna Queen before every Alpha in the kingdom. She had already proven herself through combat and council, but this would make it irrevocable. This would write her name into the history of the kingdom alongside Valen's. They dressed in formal attire befitting their station. Valen wore black leather and dark furs, his crown of twisted silver settling on his head with the weight of authority. Nessa wore a gown of deep green that brought out the color of her eyes, with silver embroidery that caught the light as she moved. Her own crown was simpler than Valen's, but no less significant. A circlet of silver wolves running nose to tail, eternal and unbroken. The Great Hall was packed with Alphas and their delegations from every corner of the kingdom. Nessa recognized many faces now, had learned the names and histories of most major packs over the past months. Alpha Grayson stood near the front, the old wolf who had tested her in council and found her worthy. Alpha Corvin was there too, the Western Alpha she had defeated in combat, now one of her staunchest supporters. The ceremony itself was ancient and solemn. Valen spoke the traditional words, declaring before all assembled that Nessa Caldwell was his chosen mate, his equal in all things, worthy to stand beside him as Luna Queen. Each Alpha was given the opportunity to voice objection or offer acknowledgement. None objected. All acknowledged. When the crown was placed on Nessa's head, when she turned to face the assembled Alphas as their Luna Queen officially recognized and formally crowned, she felt the weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders. But she also felt Valen's presence beside her through the mate bond, steady and unwavering. She didn't have to carry this weight alone. They would carry it together. The formal ceremony gave way to celebration, and eventually, Valen and Nessa found themselves on the balcony overlooking the castle grounds. Below them, the kingdom they had fought so hard to protect and rebuild spread out under the setting sun. Packs were gathering in the courtyard, wolves shifting to run together in celebration, a tradition as old as shifters themselves. They love you, Valen said quietly, watching the celebration below. Not because you're my mate, but because you've earned their respect. You're the Luna Queen they needed, even if they didn't know it 6 months ago. We did this together, Nessa corrected. Everything we've built, every change we've made, it only worked because we worked as partners. You gave me the authority, but you also listened when I challenged you. That's what makes us strong. Valen turned to her, his hand coming up to cup her face with infinite gentleness. You saved me, Nessa, Not just that night when you held off the rogues, but every day since. You saved me from becoming the kind of king who rules alone and dies alone. You showed me that strength isn't about standing apart, but about choosing who to stand with. You saved me too, Nessa said, covering his hand with hers. You refused to let me die, and then you refused to let me live halfway. You challenged me to be more than just a warrior, to be a leader, a partner, a queen. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and red. The mate bond thrummed between them, carrying emotions too deep for words. Love, trust, partnership, home. The baby is going to inherit all of this, Valen said eventually, his other hand settling on Nessa's belly where their child grew. A kingdom at peace, alliances that will hold, laws that protect rather than oppress. That's the legacy we're building. And the knowledge that strength comes from choosing to fight together rather than alone, Nessa added. That's the most important legacy we can give our child, that being bound to someone doesn't make you weaker. It makes you whole. As the sun set completely and the moon rose to take its place, Nessa and Valen shifted together. Two wolves, one black as midnight, and one the color of autumn leaves, running side by side across the castle grounds and into the forest beyond. The mate bond connected them, the life binding sustained them, and the love they had chosen anchored them. They were Alpha King and Luna Queen, mates and partners, bound by destiny and strengthened by choice. And as they ran through the moonlit forest, perfectly synchronized in movement and purpose, Nessa knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, not despite the binding, but because of everything it had taught her about herself, about Valen, about the kind of love that refused to accept anything less than everything. This was their kingdom, their legacy, their future, and they would protect it together, for as long as the moon continued to rise, and the bond between them continued to hold. Forever.